She went missing in the summer of 1988. No trace, no farewell, no clue left behind. 37 years later, she shows up. Not in person, not at a police station, but fleetingly. On a local television broadcast. Same birthmark along her cheekbone, same unmistakable gray-green eyes. But she remembers nothing. No abduction, no missing years, no past she supposedly lost. What she ends up discovering beneath the ancient oak tree in her backyard will unearth not just memories, but horrors beyond belief. Stay with us. The more you uncover, the darker this tale becomes. And let us know in the comments what you think really happened. Where are you tuning in from tonight? The old television screen flickered faintly in the corner of the room, not from any technical fault, but simply because it belonged to another time. It was one of those cumbersome RCA consoles from the late 1980s, encased in a wooden frame and perched like a relic in a dimly lit living room. Around it lay cluttered stacks of VHS tapes, picture frames coated in a fine veil of dust, and the soft, lingering scent of lavender mixed with mothballs, an olfactory time capsule. It was a calm Tuesday evening in Helena, Montana, the kind of night where twilight slips in quietly, brushing the tops of distant mountains in hues of indigo and rose. Outside, the breeze whispered gently against the windows, brushing the curtains like a breath. On screen, a news segment from a nearby town began to wrap up. Something about a high school marching band's showcase at a regional county fair. Clara Jensen hadn't meant to sit down and watch it. In fact, she rarely even turned the television on anymore. Since Paul's passing, Clara had grown more distant from the noise of modern life. The digital world, with its constant streaming and endless notifications, felt like it belonged to someone else. But something about that grainy footage, how it shimmered like a dream from another life, held her attention. In the background of a wide shot capturing the parade route and its modest crowd, there was a woman. She wasn't doing anything remarkable. No gestures, no sign waving, just standing. Wrapped in a beige overcoat and a woolen scarf, the woman stood with her hands resting calmly in front of her, unmoved by the festive commotion around her. Her face wasn't even directed toward the camera. She seemed to be looking off into the distance, or perhaps inward, as though lost in thought. And yet, someone watching the broadcast replay online would later leave a comment, just one line, that cracked open a decades-old mystery. Anyone else think the lady at 142 looks exactly like Claire Markham, the girl who disappeared from Boulder back in '88? That simple observation, posted under the re-uploaded segment, would remain buried in obscurity for nearly a week. Claire never saw it that night. She'd simply leaned back on her sofa, eyes glazed over, watching the credits scroll across the screen, blissfully, unaware that her very identity, her own obscured history, had just re-entered her life, and someone, somewhere, had recognized her. The case had long since faded from public memory. July the 12th, 1988. Boulder, Colorado. The air rippled with dry heat, the kind that glued shirts to backs and made every breeze feel like a blessing. Children zipped through the neighborhood on bicycles. Teenagers congregated around the local 7-Eleven, slurping big gulps and tossing sunflower seed shells onto the sidewalk. The smell of charred hot dogs drifted from a nearby backyard barbecue. Sprinklers hummed as they swept across neatly trimmed lawns. And amid this ordinary summer chaos, a child vanished. Her name was Claire Markham, just 6 years old. She had been drawing unicorns and stars on the pavement with sidewalk chalk, only a few feet away from her front steps on Maplewood Lane. Her mother, Leanne, was folding laundry inside. Her baby brother, Lucas, napped in a playpen just a room away. It wasn't like Claire wandered off. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was a fixture in their lives. Claire had a favorite swing at the park, a specific seat in the school cafeteria, and a red backpack covered in sparkly unicorn stickers. She didn't just disappear, she evaporated. One moment she was there, and the next, She was gone. When Leanne stepped outside just minutes later, the sidewalk chalk was still warm beneath the sun. But Claire was no longer there. No scream, no trail, no sign of struggle. Just an open wooden gate and a silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Over the following years, wild theories ignited across the community. Some whispered about a drifter seen in town days before. Others speculated about a messy custody battle, a family secret buried under layers of polite smiles. Police searched every basement, every stretch of creek bed, every meadow on the outskirts of town. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not even a single blonde hair. The story eventually faded. The Markhams sold the house and moved away. Claire Markham's school photo, big eyes, missing tooth, and all, became just another face on a missing child poster, its edges curling from rain and sun. Back in present-day Helena, Clara Jensen stirred awake to the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee. She lived alone in a modest single-story house on the quiet edge of town. Pale blue siding, wind chimes that gently clinked in the breeze, and a patchy backyard she barely used anymore. Her days followed a rigid rhythm. Feed the cat, make 2 slices of toast, drive to work at Dr. Huss Levine's dental clinic, where she sat behind the reception desk with a practiced smile and arranged paper clips like they held secrets. She was 42 now. Reserved, gentle, somewhat old-fashioned. She preferred books to television, wool cardigans to jackets, and handwritten notes to emails. Her cell phone remained on silent most days, tucked into a drawer. There was a kind of quiet distance about her, like someone who lived just slightly out of step with the world. Most people assumed she'd been an only child, that she'd always lived a life of routine and solitude. But the truth was much stranger. Claire, now Clara, had no recollection of any parents, no memories of elementary school before 5th grade, no baby photos, just albums that began mysteriously in 1994. Each one meticulously labeled by Paul Jensen, the man she called her father, the man who raised her with gentle hands and unwavering love. He often told her, "You came to me later than most kids, but you've been the best surprise of my life." She never questioned what later meant. She didn't want to. That evening, she hit rewind on a tape she'd picked up from a thrift shop. Clara had an odd little obsession. She spent weekends browsing local thrift stores, searching for old VHS tapes, weddings, home videos, forgotten news reports, anything with a date scrawled on the label. She loved the way time was frozen inside those magnetic strips, capturing glimpses of lives she'd never lived. Her collection grew. Tapes from a 1992 wedding in Arkansas, a blurry graduation celebration in Idaho, a 4th of July fireworks display in Oregon. They lined her bookshelf in chronological order, like an archive of borrowed time. Sometimes she wondered, half seriously, whether she might show up in the background of one of them, some stranger's memory, captured on accident. But that night, the revelation didn't come from a dusty cassette. It arrived silently in her inbox. A message had slipped past her filters and into the spam folder. Its subject line was unnervingly direct. "Please read. I think I know who you are." The body of the email was remarkably brief. Just a single link to a video clip from the local news dated 5 days ago, accompanied by a line of text that struck like a match in dry brush. 142. That's you. I was your neighbor in 1988. Claire didn't freeze, but something inside her stumbled. Her heart stuttered for a half-beat before regaining its rhythm. She clicked the link without thinking, her hand moving on instinct more than curiosity. The video opened with a shaky broadcast from a small-town news station. The image was fuzzy, filled with static lines and the overexposed look of low-budget field reporting. A reporter stood in front of a marching band that was mid-performance, talking about funding cuts and declining enrollment in local arts programs. The band played, out of sync but spirited, while people clapped from the sidelines. And there, standing just behind the reporter, out of focus but distinct, was a woman. Claire stared, her breath caught. The woman wore a beige coat, the same one she owned, and a patterned scarf that looked too familiar. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't waving. She was just there, silent, watching, hands loosely clasped. Claire leaned closer, squinting at the screen. That's when she noticed the comments. They were scattered, mostly small talk or jokes about the band's tempo. But one stood out. "Look at the woman in the background. Is it just me, or does she look exactly like Claire Markham? Scar on her left arm near the elbow." Claire's hand trembled as she rolled up her sleeve. There it was, a faint, crescent-shaped scar on her left arm, right where the commenter had said. She had always believed she got it from falling off her bike as a child, though she couldn't quite recall when, or where, or even which bike. Her mind had always filled in the blanks with assumed memories, but now doubt trickled in like water through cracked cement. At work the next morning, Claire moved through her tasks with robotic efficiency. The dental office buzzed as usual. Phones ringing, hygienists chatting, the sharp whine of polishing tools. Yet every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The buzz of fluorescent lights throbbed in her ears, and the hum of the overhead fan felt almost unbearable. Even her name tag, Claire Jensen, looked suddenly unfamiliar, like a label applied to someone else's life. That night, unable to shake the unease, she pulled out the oldest photo album Paul had ever made for her. She had never questioned it before. It began in winter 1994. There were no baby pictures, no toddler birthdays. The first image was of her and Paul standing in front of their mailbox, the snow piled high around them. She was bundled up, smiling easily, as if she had always belonged. But now, a subtle detail caught her eye, something she had never noticed before. Stuck to the side of the mailbox was a faded, glittering sticker. A unicorn, the same type she used to plaster all over her school backpack. Her fingers tightened around the photo. She had never told Paul about the stickers. She didn't remember telling anyone. A knock at the door yanked her from the memory. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she opened it. A woman stood on the porch, mid-40s, short brown hair tucked behind her ears, fingers fumbling nervously with a folded piece of paper. Her expression was hesitant, but there was something urgent in her eyes. "Claire?" she asked, voice cautious but clear. "Yes," Claire replied, though it came out more like a question. "I'm sorry to drop in like this," the woman said quickly. "My name is Amy Callahan. I know this is going to sound completely crazy, but I think I knew you when we were kids." Claire blinked. Amy's voice shook slightly as she reached into her coat and pulled out the paper. It was a photograph, worn and faded from age, a second-grade class picture. Maplewood Elementary, 1987. 20 children lined up in rows in front of a painted banner, all innocent smiles and gap-toothed grins. In the front row, a girl with dark braids and a red bow stared at the camera, hands folded neatly in her lap. Amy held the photo toward her. "That's you," she said, her voice trembling. "You were my best friend. You were Claire Markham, and then one day, you were just gone." Claire stared down at the image. Her knees weakened. The girl in the photo, her expression, her smile, her eyes, was unmistakable. The scar, the bow. It was her, yet none of it sparked a memory. She didn't remember wearing those clothes, didn't recognize the other children. It felt like looking into someone else's life through a fogged window. Amy continued, her voice barely a whisper now. "They told us you were dead, that something terrible had happened to you." But Claire was standing here, very much alive, and she had no memory of ever being lost. She didn't speak. She just took the photo and closed the door softly. Amy left her phone number on a napkin, slid it through the crack before she walked away. The photograph remained on the kitchen table for days. Claire never moved it. She would glance at it in passing, again and again. 20 children frozen in time. A banner declaring Maplewood Elementary, class of '87. And that girl in the front row, her tiny hands resting calmly in her lap, her red bow tied just right. Claire couldn't deny it anymore. It was her face. But her memories told a different story. She had lived in Helena since she was 11, or so she'd believed. Paul Jensen had been her guardian, her anchor, her everything. A quiet, solitary man who worked at the local sawmill and collected vinyl records he never actually played. He was distant, but he was dependable. He cooked dinner every night. He labeled her lunchboxes. He read her quiet bedtime stories about stars and the people they used to be. When she was 12, she had asked him about her mother. He had said simply, "She couldn't stay, but she loved you. That's all you need to know." Claire hadn't pressed. Life had seemed normal, quiet, familiar. She attended Jefferson High School, ran track, and made one close friend, Natalie Chen, who had a habit of decorating her binders with magazine cutouts and dreaming of leaving for the West Coast. Claire never left. She stayed behind, working first at a cozy bookstore before settling into the dental office job when Paul fell ill and the bills piled up. She had dated once, a man named Ethan from Missoula, an engineer who loved hiking and talking about city planning. They had lasted almost 2 years. He said she was sweet, but often distant. "You always feel like your mind's somewhere else," he told her once, gently. She hadn't known how to reply, because in some strange way, he was right. There was always a part of her that felt removed, like she was living a life that had skipped its opening chapters. She couldn't remember her first day of school, couldn't recall learning how to tie her shoes or riding her first bike. She had no memories of any birthday before her 10th. It wasn't something she thought about often, until now. Now it haunted her. Some evenings it came back to her unexpectedly. A scent in the air, freshly cut grass, barbecue smoke, or a song from the late '80s playing in a grocery store. And something inside her chest would flicker, like a name she should remember, like a face just out of reach. She sat in her backyard now, legs crossed, the class photo resting in her lap. The sun had dipped low, casting everything in gold and shadow. A wind chime above her tinkled softly in the breeze. She hadn't contacted Amy again. After that night, Claire thanked her politely, said she needed time, and gently closed the door. But she had Googled everything. Claire Markham, missing, 1988, Boulder, Colorado. She found a handful of articles, old, sparse, mostly archived fragments. There were faded news clippings, a few brief televised segments preserved digitally, and grainy photographs of a 6-year-old girl with a gapped smile, clutching a unicorn backpack. In some, the tiny scar on her left elbow was just barely visible, a faint curve the size of a fingernail. Each article seemed to reference the same moment. She was last seen outside her house, around 4:15 p.m., crouched on the sidewalk, coloring with chalk. Claire's hand covered her mouth. She had never told anyone this before. Not Paul, not Ethan, not even Natalie. But she had always hated the sound of sidewalk chalk. Even now, the very thought of it scraped against her nerves like nails on glass. That high-pitched squeal, the powdery residue it left behind. It made her skin crawl. Was that a real memory surfacing or just the power of suggestion playing tricks on her? Back at work, she began watching herself through a different lens. Her own reflection, once familiar, now looked subtly alien. In the darkened glass of the office window, she saw the way her fingers danced lightly over the keyboard, fast and precise. She noticed the way she flinched when the sterilizer hissed or the receptionist dropped a clipboard, how her eyes darted away in conversation, never quite holding contact too long. She studied these details like a detective building a profile, not of a suspect, but of herself. That night, as if led by some unseen guide, she climbed onto a step stool and reached for a shoebox on the top shelf of her bedroom closet. It was the kind of place where forgotten things lived. Christmas cards, old receipts, yellowing coupons. Inside it, nestled between a cracked ornament and a child's drawing of a tree, was a maroon leather-bound notebook. The corners were bent, the spine worn smooth by time. A delicate, long-dead flower had been pressed between the first 2 pages, its color faded but intact. There was no name on the cover, no inscription inside, only dates. The first entry began in September 1994. Claire is adjusting well, still very quiet, but I'm told that's normal given the circumstances. She turned the page. She flinched when I dropped a glass in the kitchen. Loud sounds scare her. I think she's having trouble sleeping. Claire sat down on the bed, her fingers tightening on the cover. She asked today why there are no baby pictures. I told her they were lost in a storage flood. She believed me, or at least pretended to. Another page. I feel like a criminal. She swallowed hard. Page after page, the handwriting never changed. It was Paul's, neat, slanted, precise. The journal unfolded not like a diary, but like a quiet confession spread out over time. Observations, reflections, worries. There was love in every word. That much was clear. But buried underneath, stitched into the spaces between the lines, was something else. A guilt that bled out, slow and steady. I never asked where she came from. I just agreed to take care of her. I believed I was doing the right thing. Maybe I was. But the nights are getting harder. More pages. She cries sometimes. She talks in her sleep. I can't make out the name she's calling, but I don't think it's mine. Claire closed the journal. Her hands trembled as she placed them gently beside her. Her whole life had been framed by gentleness, safety, and stability. But that life was constructed on omissions, delicate lies, and words that had never been spoken aloud. The next day, she visited the public library. She searched birth records, school enrollment forms, and census data. She checked for any official documentation under the name Claire Jensen before 1994. There was nothing. No birth certificate, no immunization history, no report cards from elementary school. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere at age 11. She sat in the dusty corner of the archives room, surrounded by yellowed folders and glowing microfilm, trying not to cry. A librarian passed her desk and stopped, her expression gentle. "Need any help?" she asked kindly. Claire looked up, dazed. "I think I've been missing for a long time," she replied, barely above a whisper. Hundreds of miles away in Spokane, Margaret Doyle, a retired journalist now aged 71, sat in her small apartment surrounded by stacks of old files and newspaper clippings. Once a relentless investigative reporter, Margaret now spends her time digitizing decades-old cold cases for a modest true crime blog. She hadn't thought about Claire Markham in years, not since the case had gone cold. Not until last week, when a reader emailed her a video clip. She opened the file out of habit. As the footage played, her breath caught in her throat. It was her. Margaret recognized that face instantly. The same eyes, the same hesitant posture. "She's alive," she whispered, hand trembling as she reached for a notepad. She pulled her original case notes from storage. Her handwriting stared back at her, looping and brisk. One entry jumped out. Witness across the street, elderly woman, reported seeing a light blue sedan parked near the Markham home the afternoon Claire disappeared. The driver was described as male, in his 40s, long coat, never identified. Margaret had followed that thread obsessively. No license plate. No confirmation. Eventually, suspicion shifted toward Leanne's ex-husband, but that theory hit a dead end, and the trail went cold. Now, decades later, the little girl whose photo had haunted her desk had seemingly reappeared. She picked up the phone. "I need to speak with someone at the Helena Police Department." Meanwhile, Claire stood in her garage, staring at 4 large boxes that had always been off limits. Paul used to tell her they held old tools, broken appliances, nothing worth bothering with. But today, something in her gut told her otherwise. She broke the rusted lock and opened the box marked "See Inside" were crayon drawings, stick figure families under rainbows, scribbled names she didn't recognize. One read, "To Clary, love Mommy." Another depicted a little house labeled with 3 names, me, Mommy, and Luca. Her breath hitched. The handwriting was undeniably hers. At the bottom of the box was a cassette tape, labeled in fading ink, "Claire, age 5. She held it in her hand like it was made of glass. It felt warm, alive, a message from a version of herself she could no longer remember, a voice locked away in magnetic tape, but she had no way to hear it. Cassette players were relics now. She placed the tape on her coffee table. It sat there like a living thing, daring her to bridge the gap between past and present. The next morning, Claire drove across town to a thrift store called Whistle Stop Treasures. The windows were dusty, and the sign out front creaked in the wind. Tucked between an auto repair shop and a boarded-up diner, the store looked half-forgotten. Inside, it smelled of mildew and lemon polish. Shelves were stacked with old radios, VHS players, cracked mirrors, and kitchen appliances from decades past. Along the back wall, buried beneath a wobbling pile of clock radios, she found what she was looking for. A small cassette player, coated in dust and nostalgia. It was priced at $6. As she carried it to the counter, the woman behind the register squinted at it, then at her. "Haven't sold one of those in years," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "Funny little thing to be drawn to." Claire smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. She paid in cash. Claire offered a nervous, fleeting smile as she handed over the crumpled bills. "I guess I'm trying to remember something," she said softly. Back home, she drew the blinds closed, silencing the world outside. She unplugged the refrigerator just to mute its constant hum, then lowered herself onto the living room rug, crossing her legs beneath her. The cassette player felt foreign in her hands, heavy with history. She slid the tape inside and pressed play. The machine clicked. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static, like distant waves crashing in the dark. Then came a voice. Not hers, not Paul's. A woman's voice, warm and gentle, filled the room. "Okay, you ready, sweetheart? Let's sing our favorite." There was a pause, the sound of fabric shifting, a distant giggle. Then a high, delicate voice, familiar in a way that struck Claire deep in the chest, began to sing, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." She froze. The air seemed to leave the room. It was her voice. She knew it not from memory, but from marrow. The woman began to sing along in harmony, her tone soft, loving, a lullaby woven with devotion. At the song's end, the woman laughed, a sound like chimes in a gentle breeze. "That was perfect, Clary. Mommy's so proud of you." Claire's stomach flipped. The word hit like an avalanche. Mommy. She didn't recognize the voice, not consciously, but the tenderness, the warmth, the way the word Clary rolled off her tongue. It unlatched something. Tears stung her eyes. The woman said, "Say good night." A smaller voice replied, "Good night, tape." Claire pressed to stop. Her hands were trembling. She didn't sleep that night. She just played the tape over and over until the batteries wore out. The song, the laughter, the way the woman said her name, a name she hadn't heard in decades. The sound carried with it pieces, images without context. She began to remember, not fully, but in flashes. The feel of a scratchy green couch, the sharp slam of a screen door in summer, the warm scent of cinnamon toast carried on a breeze through an open kitchen window. The memories didn't flow. They cracked open. Fragments scattered across her mind like shattered glass, impossible to piece together, but unmistakably real. 2 days later, her phone rang. She hadn't saved the number, but the voice was instantly familiar. "Hey," Amy said hesitantly. "I'm sorry to call, but something weird happened." Claire sat up straighter. "Go on." "I went back to my mom's place in Boulder, just helping her sort some stuff. Old boxes in the attic. I found a drawing. I think it's from you. It's us, you and me. You wrote 'Me and Amy best friends forever' in that backward kindergarten handwriting." Claire blinked. "I don't remember that." "I figured," Amy said softly. "But there's something else. There's a third person in the drawing." Amy's voice wavered. "A tall man. He's wearing a long coat, and his name, it's been scratched out, like, violently. I think you were afraid of him." Claire didn't speak. Her mouth had gone dry. After a pause, Amy added, "I'm bringing it to you." That night, Claire sat on her porch wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes tracing the stars. The sky seemed endless, a canvas of silence. She tried to force her mind back, past the fog, beyond the edge of her remembered life. But there was only darkness. Except for one thing, a dream, one she used to have as a child. Over and over again. She'd be in the back seat of a moving car. Trees flew past the window, her tiny hand pressed against the glass. A voice hummed in the front seat. Then, nothing. Cold. Silence. Emptiness. She would always wake up crying. Paul used to tell her it was just a nightmare. Now, she wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, in Spokane, Margaret Doyle printed out every document she could find related to the Markham case. She combed through her original notes, pieced together a timeline, reconstructed maps, and reviewed overlooked leads. One stood out, a report from 1989. A woman had called in claiming to see Claire at a gas station in Butte, Montana. The tip had been dismissed, chalked up to a mistake, maybe confusion. But Butte was just 2 hours from Helena. Margaret reopened the file. It had never been followed up properly. She booked a flight. Back in Montana, Claire met Amy at a quiet cafe tucked off the main road. The place smelled like espresso and cinnamon, and the lighting was soft, golden. Amy looked older now, more delicate, but her eyes were the same. Kind, searching. They embraced awkwardly before Amy slid the drawing across the table. Claire stared. 2 little girls with stick limbs, one labeled Me, the other Amy. Between them stood a towering figure scribbled out in thick, angry black crayon. Claire reached out. Her hand hovered over the image. "I was scared of him," she whispered. Amy nodded. "You wouldn't say his name, not even once." Claire's eyes didn't leave the paper. "I think he took me." In the days that followed, more fragments surfaced. In a box of old sweaters, she found a bracelet, woven thread in rainbow colors. She had no memory of it, but it fit perfectly around her wrist. She wore it without question. She returned to the library, dug into school yearbooks from Boulder. One from 1987 had a photo. Her photo, 2nd grade. Claire Markham. She showed it to Natalie, her oldest friend in Helena. Natalie stared in disbelief. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Claire swallowed. "Because I didn't know." Meanwhile, the Helena Police Department had assigned Detective Rosa Mendez to the case after receiving Margaret's files. Rosa was 39. She had lost a daughter in childbirth and carried a quiet determination in everything she did. Claire's story ignited something in her, a need to dig. She visited Claire's home, sat across from her, took notes slowly. "Do you remember the name Paul Jensen?" Rosa asked. Claire nodded. "He raised me." "Do you know how he came to have custody?" Claire frowned. "Number he just always had me." "There are no records," Rosa said gently. "No adoption, no legal transfer, nothing. You just appear." Claire felt a pressure behind her eyes. Then Rosa asked, "Did Paul ever mention someone named Lyle?" The name hit like a physical blow. Claire's chest tightened. She shook her head, but then said faintly, "It sounds wrong. I don't know why." That evening, Claire opened her mailbox and found an envelope. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a black and white photograph of a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, holding a baby on her hip. On the back, in faded ink, Leanne and Claire, 1982. Claire collapsed into the porch chair, the photograph trembling in her fingers. That was her mother. That was her. Someone had been watching, long enough to send proof. The next morning, Claire noticed the basement door ajar. She rarely went down there. It was Paul's domain. Boxes of tools, old furniture, things left to collect dust. But today, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, she descended the creaking wooden stairs. The air was damp, cold, smelled of rust and old earth. In the far corner, half covered by a tarp, sat a suitcase. Brown leather, worn, scuffed at the corners. She lifted the latches and opened it. Inside, a faded baby blanket, a small music box shaped like a unicorn, a child's worn shoe, and beneath it all, a folded page torn from a storybook. At the top, it read, "The Story of You." She opened it. On the first page of the book, printed in delicate, fading font, were the words, "This book belongs to Claire Markham." Claire's breath hitched. Then, from somewhere above, upstairs, a sudden creak, the unmistakable sound of a door shifting slightly on its hinges. She froze. A long silence followed. Her body crouched low beside the suitcase in the basement, barely moving, lungs clenching tight with every breath. The noise didn't come again, but the tension lingered like smoke. For what felt like hours, she stayed there, perfectly still. The air was thick, heavy with dust and dread. No footsteps, no voice, not even the creak of a floorboard. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was nothing. Eventually she stood, quietly lifting the suitcase, her movements deliberate and slow. She climbed the basement stairs one by one and locked the door behind her. The key turned with a soft click. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, like it was shrinking inward, hiding something in its walls. She placed the suitcase on the floor by the couch and curled around it, arms wrapped tightly as the last of the daylight filtered through the blinds. She didn't sleep, couldn't. Instead, she wound the tiny crank on the old music box. A lullaby floated out, slightly warped, notes bending out of key. The tune was familiar, not just the melody, but the feeling it stirred. The memory of being held, of being loved before memory itself had words. Tears filled her eyes, the kind that rises not from sadness but from something deeper, something that had been missing for so long, you forgot it was gone. The next morning she called Amy. "I need you to come over," Claire said. Amy arrived in less than half an hour. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, but her hands didn't tremble. She was ready. Claire didn't say much. She just opened the suitcase. She showed him the baby's shoe, the music box, the page from the storybook bearing her name. Amy lowered herself slowly into the armchair, eyes never leaving the objects. "You're her," Amy said quietly. "You really are." Claire nodded once, barely. Amy's gaze drifted around the room as if she were seeing it anew. "This house," she said, "it's quiet. Too quiet." Claire sat beside her. "It always was." Amy leaned in. "What do you want to do next?" Claire stared at the storybook page. "Find out who took me." Detective Rosa Mendes arranged an official interview the next day. She arrived at Claire's home with a soft-spoken demeanor and a small digital recorder. Her notebook was nearly full already. She began with a question, her tone gentle but firm. "Do you feel safe here, Claire?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She stared at the floor, the music box still in her lap. "I don't know anymore." Rosa nodded. "I believe you were taken, but proving it, that's a challenge. Your Social Security number was issued in 1994. That's when Paul first enrolled you in school. Before that, there's nothing. No fingerprints, no vaccinations, no pediatrician visits. It's like you didn't exist. Claire nodded again. The yearbook photo, 2nd grade, Boulder, 1987. That's our best lead so far, Rosa agreed. It places you as alive and local before you became Claire Jensen. She flipped a page in her file. There's more. We found a police report from 1988. A neighbor on Maplewood Lane reported a blue sedan parked for hours outside the Markham residence. Inside, it was a man who matched Paul Jensen's description. Claire's lips parted. Her voice was barely audible. Are you saying Paul took me? Rosa didn't answer immediately. We're not sure. It's possible he was involved. It's also possible he was manipulated, used. But someone went to great lengths to erase your identity, Claire. Claire gripped the armrest of the chair, knuckles whitening. He was kind to me, she whispered. He raised me like I was his own. I believe that, Rosa said. But kindness doesn't erase guilt. 2 days later, Margaret Doyle arrived in Helena. Time had curved her spine and worn her down, but her eyes still burned with purpose. She and Claire met at a small diner just outside of town. Margaret's binder was thick, frayed at the corners, filled with fading photocopies and handwritten notes. I never stopped following your story, Margaret said, sliding it across the table. Inside were dozens of leads, most dismissed, forgotten by the world. Claire flipped to a section marked Discarded Reports. One entry caught her eye. Butte, Montana, 1989. A gas station. A woman had reported seeing a girl who looked like Claire, standing silently beside a man in a long coat. The child hadn't spoken. Her eyes, the report said, looked hollow. Claire felt a chill run through her. That's always how I see myself, she whispered. In the back seat. Trees are going by, never talking, never moving. Margaret leaned forward. You remember? Not with my head, Claire said, but maybe with my body. That weekend they drove to Butte together. The gas station was still there, though barely. The windows were boarded up. The sign had long since faded, and weeds cracked through the pavement. Claire walked slowly around the lot, something pulling her toward a rusted soda machine. She stood in front of it and closed her eyes. And then it came. A flash. Sharp, painful. She was 5, standing next to a tall man. She was sucking her thumb. A car engine idled nearby. He held her hand firmly. When she looked up, it wasn't Paul. The man had brown eyes, a long, heavy coat, fingertips stained like he'd been painting or smoking or both. Claire gasped and stumbled back. Margaret caught her by the elbow. What is it? It wasn't Paul, Claire said. I saw his face. He wasn't the one who took me. I think Paul got me after. Back in Helena, she told Rosa everything. The detective opened a fresh file and placed it beside the others. There was a man named Lyle Kretik, she said, a former social worker. He had several complaints against him for misconduct in the late 1980s. No convictions. Then he vanished. Last seen in 1991, Claire's brow furrowed. Lyle. That's the name you asked me about before. Rosa nodded. He worked for a private agency, now defunct, that handled child welfare placements. The agency was shut down after they were caught forging custody papers. Claire's mouth went dry. You think he sold me? Rosa didn't flinch. We can't prove that. Not yet. But someone filed custody papers under Paul Jensen's name in late '88. They weren't notarized. No court seal, just handwriting. Just enough to seem legitimate if no one looked too closely. So Paul might not have known. We don't know what Paul believed, Rosa said softly. But the version of you he raised had already been erased. In the following days, everything changed. A leak to the media caused Claire's story to hit the local news. Missing girl from 1988 may be living in Montana. It spread like wildfire. Neighbors from Boulder reached out. Some said they remembered her. One sent a Christmas photo from a party in 87 Claire in a red sweater, grinning shyly, standing next to a woman who might have been her mother. Suddenly, her life wasn't hers alone. As news of Claire's possible identity spread, the reactions were mixed. Some believed instantly, their voices rising in support across forums and comment sections. Others were skeptical, picking apart details, questioning timelines. Reporters began calling. Emails flooded in. She stopped answering her phone altogether. Once again, she drew her blinds closed, a fortress of fabric and silence. At the grocery store, she wore sunglasses, kept her head low. Every face felt like it was watching her, every whisper a judgment. Her dreams changed. They became louder, more chaotic. Voices shouting from behind, doors, slamming sounds. The sensation of her small wrist being yanked by someone much stronger. She'd wake in a sweat, her pulse racing, air catching in her throat. But she wasn't alone anymore. Amy came by every morning with coffee and something warm to eat. Margaret checked in by phone or visited when she could. "You're not alone," Amy reminded her constantly, gently. Claire would whisper back, "But I was, for a very long time." One afternoon, Amy arrived holding something in a paper bag. "Found this in a thrift bin near Pearl Street," she said. "I don't know if it means anything." Claire opened the bag. Inside was a worn first-grade yearbook from a Boulder elementary school. She flipped through it slowly, page by page, rows of smiling children under smudged class headers. Then, suddenly, her own handwriting stopped her heart. "Claire Markham, I want to be a singer when I grow up." Tears welled in her eyes. She didn't remember writing it, but somehow she knew it had once been her dream. She could almost see it. The little girl singing on a swing set, splashing in the bathtub, inventing songs for dolls. Paul had always told her she had a quiet voice. Good for reading, not for shouting. Maybe he just never wanted her to raise it. That evening, across town in a modest hotel room, Margaret Doyle received a strange package. No return address, no name, just a brown envelope with a single item inside. A VHS tape and a note. "You're not the only one who kept receipts." Margaret's hands trembled as she inserted the tape into the borrowed player. Static danced across the screen, followed by a logo for a local news channel, circa 1989. Footage began to play. A younger version of herself, interviewing a Boulder police officer. In the background, partially obscured, a sedan. Someone was loading boxes into the trunk. In the back seat, barely visible, a little girl. Margaret froze the frame. "Claire," she breathed. Claire leaned forward, staring at the screen. "It's me," she whispered. Margaret zoomed in, adjusting the tracking. Next to the car stood a man, heavy coat, dark brown hair, clipboard tucked under one arm. She reached for a photograph in her binder, laid it next to the screen. Same face, Lyle Craddock. They had him. Sort of. Not arrested. Not yet. But connected. Visible. Real. Rosa initiated a formal investigation. She filed an official notice with the state, requesting a deep search into defunct child welfare agencies that had operated in Colorado between 1985 and 1991. Meanwhile, Claire sat on her porch as rain trickled from the gutters, soaking the edge of the wooden steps. She watched droplets slide down the railing and tried to process the flood of truth rushing into her life. So much of her past had been constructed out of shadows, bits and pieces pieced together through silence and suggestion. Now, the lights were flickering on, but the image remained blurry. The outlines were there. The clarity wasn't. A few days later, another envelope appeared on her kitchen counter. No stamp, no address, no markings. Inside, just one line typed neatly on a strip of paper. "She's still alive. If you want the truth, go to the place with the unicorn." Claire's hands trembled as she read the note again, then again. Her brain fired off images like sparks. The unicorn music box, the unicorn blanket in the suitcase, the sticker on her childhood backpack, the drawing tucked into the lunchbox buried under the tree. Unicorns weren't just a theme. They were a breadcrumb trail, a coded message from her past. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the envelope. Only one place in the world tied all those memories together. The old house in Boulder. The one on Maplewood Lane. The place where she had vanished. The place she hadn't seen since she was 6 years old. The house had changed hands several times. Renovated, painted. But Claire believed the land remembered. The walls, the soil, the trees. Places hold things people forget. She packed a small bag and called Amy. "I need to go to Boulder." Amy didn't ask questions. "I'm coming with you." They left that evening, driving overnight. The car hummed beneath them, headlights sweeping across long stretches of highway. Claire sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The trees blurred past, shadows on repeat. Her heart pounded with every mile. She didn't know what she was hoping to find, but her body seemed to know the way. By dawn, they turned onto Maplewood Lane. The house was still there, smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she was just taller now. A white fence bordered the yard. The porch steps had been replaced, but the shape of it, the bones of it, were the same. Claire stepped out of the car slowly. She stood there, frozen. It felt like walking into a ghost. The current owners were away. Margaret had arranged a brief visit under the pretense of writing a piece for a local history project. The realtor had left the key under the mat. Claire stepped through the doorway. The floor groaned beneath her feet. The living room, once a sanctuary of play and laughter, was bare now. Hollow. She ran her fingers along the wall as she moved down the hall, her footsteps muffled on the old carpet. Amy waited near the door, giving her space. Claire turned left into a bedroom. She knew it before she even opened the door. Inside, the closet beckoned. She opened it and crouched down. The lower wall showed faint scratches, like someone had once dragged their nails across the paint, over and over. In the corner, where the floor met the wall, something was wedged between the boards. Claire pried it out gently. A tiny beaded bracelet, pink and purple, threadbare, child-sized. She brought it to her lips, tears threatening to fall. Outside, the backyard had overgrown wildly. The swing set was long gone, but the old oak tree still stood at the edge of the fence, towering, quiet. Claire walked to it as if in a trance. She knelt, began to dig. Just inches beneath the soil, her fingers struck metal, a rusted tin lunchbox. Inside, a drawing, simple but clear, of a woman and child labeled Mommy and Me. A photo of Claire in a pink dress, age 5, and a note, scrawled in a child's crooked handwriting. "If someone finds me, please take me back to my mom. She has the pink house. I miss her." Claire's throat closed. Amy knelt beside her. "Oh my God," Amy whispered. Claire nodded, holding the letter to her chest. "I wrote this." Back at the motel, Margaret was waiting. She had papers spread across the bed. "This," she said, pointing, "is Lyle Craddock. Arrest records, mugshots, newspaper articles. He was arrested in 1991, child endangerment, charges dropped. Then he disappeared again." Claire stared at the photographs. "That's him," she confirmed. Margaret continued. "He worked through multiple underground networks. They pretended to be private adoption agencies. They moved children like freight." Amy's voice shook. "So, Paul Jensen." Margaret's voice trailed off with a heavy sigh as she laid out the final piece of a deeply painful puzzle. "He was one of the buyers." Claire's breath caught. Her stomach twisted as if she'd been punched from the inside. "No," she said, barely above a whisper. "He wasn't like that." Her voice trembled. "He was kind. He didn't hurt me." Margaret's expression softened, but her tone held firm. "Claire, kindness doesn't erase complicity." The next morning, Detective Rosa Mendes arrived in Boulder to chase a final lead. She had traced Lyle Craddock's last known residence to a rusted-out trailer on the far edge of town. Condemned, abandoned, but still intact. Inside, amid the peeling walls and water-damaged floors, Rosa found a single cardboard box. Dust coated its surface. Inside were scattered files, many water-stained or half-burned. One folder stood out, labeled simply CLAM, Hold for Private Arrangement, 12/88. Rosa opened it. Her heart dropped. Inside was a forged birth certificate bearing the name Claire Jensen, a falsified custody transfer form, and a photo. Claire, 6 years old, her expression blank, staring directly into the camera lens. In black marker across the top of the page, finalized. Rosa called Claire immediately. "This proves it," she said. "You were sold." Claire sat on the edge of her motel bed, the phone pressed against her ear, but her mind 1,000 miles away. Her hand shook, her eyes burned. But she couldn't cry, not yet. She was a child, a living, breathing child. And someone had put a price on her like a piece of merchandise. And then, just as everything began to fall into place, came a twist no one saw coming. The Boulder Medical Examiner's Office contacted Rosa. A year earlier, a woman named Leanne Markham had submitted a DNA sample to a national database for missing persons. She had done so after watching a cold case documentary, suspecting her daughter might still be alive somewhere. At the time, there were no matches. But Rosa ordered a recheck now using Claire's fresh DNA profile. The results were returned 3 days later. A Kilens Venkilens Eges Kilens Venkilens Shazad Shazalek match. Claire Markham had been found. Her mother, Leanne, was alive. Claire couldn't speak when she heard the news. She sat in the dark, alone in the motel room, the envelope in her hands, its seal already broken, but its truth still hard to grasp. Amy paced softly nearby, watching with quiet concern. "I should be happy," Claire whispered into the silence. Amy stopped. "You're allowed to feel everything, Claire. I don't remember her." "You don't have to," Amy said gently. "She remembers you." A meeting was arranged at a small church in Boulder, neutral, quiet, calm. Claire arrived early. She sat in a pew, her hands clasped, her pulse racing in her ears. Her palms were slick with sweat. Then the door creaked open. Leanne entered slowly. She was older now, her once dark hair streaked with gray, fine lines at the corners of her eyes. But her eyes? Claire recognized them immediately. They were the same eyes that had looked out from the photograph in the lunchbox buried beneath the tree. Claire stood. Neither spoke for a moment. The air between them held decades. Then Leanne rushed forward, arms open, and embraced her daughter. Tight, unyielding, weeping openly. "My baby," she sobbed. "My Clary." And Claire, for the first time in her life, felt something she'd never quite known how to name. She felt at home. They spent hours talking. Leanne told stories of a 6-year-old girl who sang to the family cat, who collected unicorn stickers, and who insisted on cinnamon toast every morning. She spoke of bath times and bedtime songs, of scraped knees and birthday parties. Some of it felt familiar. Some didn't, but all of it felt right. Claire learned that her baby brother Lucas had died in a car crash at 17. Her father had succumbed to cancer not long after. That Leanne had never stopped searching. She had remortgaged the house, sold her car, and gone broke chasing shadows of hope. But she never gave up. A week later, Rosa delivered a final discovery. From a storage unit once rented by Paul Jensen, investigators had recovered a bundle of handwritten letters. Some were never sent. Most were private reflections. And in them, Claire found the truth. Paul had known. Not immediately, but years later he discovered the documents had been forged, that Lyle had lied, that Claire had been taken, not surrendered. But Paul never came forward. One letter read, "She is my whole world." I didn't take him, but I can't give her back. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe that makes me a monster. But I love her like she's mine. Claire read the words over and over. Her hands trembled, her eyes blurred. She had loved him. Deeply. He had been her world too. Now she wasn't sure who he truly was. A thief of innocence, or a man who tried to right a wrong by building a home out of stolen time. That same day, another envelope appeared at her door in Helena. Inside, a photograph. A little girl, no older than 5, smiling at the camera, clutching a unicorn plush. Written on the back in shaky pen, "She's not the only one." For 3 days, rain blanketed Helena in a steady, mournful drizzle. Streets were slick, windows fogged. People moved more slowly. Inside her quiet home, Claire Markham sat by the window, the photo on her lap. She stared at it for hours. Another child, another life rewritten, another secret not yet told. Paul's final letter, the one Rosa had delivered, haunted her. "I don't know if you'll ever learn the truth, Claire," he had written, "but if you do, I hope you understand. I never meant to be the villain in your story. You were light in a dark room, a reason to keep breathing. I didn't take you, but I kept you, and maybe that was just as cruel." Claire had read it more than a dozen times, and every time, she cried. She cried for the man who raised her. She cried for the girl who was taken. She cried for the woman she had become, because all of them were real. All of them were her. Leanne visited Helena soon after. They met at a cafe tucked between a florist and a bookstore. Leanne walked in slowly, nervously, unsure of her place. Claire stood. They hugged longer this time, firmer, real. They sat across from each other, teacups in hand. Leanne spoke first. "Every morning I wake up and I wait for it to vanish. This feeling, this life. Like I'll realize it was just a dream." Claire smiled softly. "I used to dream I had a mother. I just didn't know if she was real." Leanne reached across the table and took her hand. "You were never gone from me, Clary." "Not really." Claire's voice wavered. "I wish I remembered more." "You don't have to," Leanne whispered. "We can start from here." They spent the afternoon walking. Through the town park, past the local bookstore, into the grocery store where Claire worked. They shared memories and silences, letting the lost years settle like dust behind them. Because they had found each other. And because sometimes the story begins again. Not at the beginning, but where the light finally breaks through. Leanne leaned forward, her eyes glistening with quiet wonder. "What's your favorite meal?" she asked. "How do you like your coffee? What time do you wake up?" Claire chuckled, surprised by the simplicity of the questions. "Spaghetti with too much garlic. I don't drink coffee, and usually around 6:30. She looked at her mother, then added, "Why?" Leanne smiled. "I just want to know you." Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she listened as Leanne shared fragments of her own memories, of bedtime rituals in Boulder, lining up stuffed animals with surgical precision before sleep, refusing to eat green grapes because they taste too sneaky, and the worm named Martin she insisted was her best friend for 3 whole days. They laughed. They cried. Hours passed unnoticed. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the two sat side by side on a weathered bench near the river, the sky painted in soft strokes of amber and rose. "I want to show you something," Claire said, pulling out the faded drawing she'd unearthed from the rusted lunchbox. Leanne took it in her hands and gasped softly. "You kept this?" Claire nodded, voice catching. "I buried it. I think I knew someone would find it one day." They held the paper between them, the edges worn, the colors muted, but the image still clear. A child's version of hope, preserved by time. The river behind them moved slowly, and the scent of pine drifted gently in the breeze. Elsewhere, Margaret packed her suitcase in Spokane. She had turned down every publishing offer that came her way. "This story," she told the press, "belongs to Claire, not to me." Before she left town, she met with Claire one final time. They sat on a park bench not far from Claire's home. Margaret's gaze lingered on her. "I was 35 when you disappeared," she said, her voice low. "I followed your case like it was personal. Drove past your school once or twice. I still blame myself for not digging deeper." Claire reached across and took her hand. "You helped find me," she said quietly. "That's what matters now." Margaret nodded, lips pressing into a bittersweet smile. "If you ever want to tell your story, I'll help you do it the right way." Claire considered that, then gave a faint smile. Maybe someday. Amy, meanwhile, had become a constant in Claire's life once more. Not just a piece of the past, but a part of her new present. Together, they wandered old neighborhoods, tracing childhood footprints. They found their elementary school, still standing, though the playground had a new coat of paint. Claire climbed the monkey bars slowly, as if retracing forgotten steps. Amy snapped a photo. "You were always braver than I?" she teased. Claire shook her head, smiling. "No, I think I just forgot how scared I was." Silence followed, gentle and warm. Then Amy asked softly, "Do you want to find the other girl?" Claire turned to her. "I have to." Detective Rosa Mendes took the lead. The unicorn plush from the mysterious photo had been part of a limited edition run in 1986, sold only in 3 Western states. Rosa cross-referenced this with missing persons cases from that time, girls between the ages of 4 and 7 who disappeared under suspicious or undocumented circumstances. One name rose to the top: Madison Riley. Disappeared in 1989 from Salt Lake City. No leads, no suspects. Just one note. A unicorn toy was missing from her bed. Rosa arranged a meeting with Madison's mother, Karen Riley, now 63. Claire insisted on going with her. The meeting took place in a quiet public library, inside a small private room lined with dusty bookshelves. Karen sat at the table, her hands trembling as she stared at Claire. You look like her," Karen whispered, barely audible. "Same cheekbones, same eyes." Claire reached into her bag and pulled out the unicorn music box. She slid it gently across the table. "I think our lives were connected," she said. Karen took the box in her shaking hands. Tears streamed down her face silently. "I thought I was going crazy," she said. "That I was broken, holding on to something I should have let go." Claire placed her hand gently over hers. "You weren't broken. You were just left waiting." The room was filled with the soft tick of an old clock on the wall. Neither spoke. Words, for once, seemed unnecessary. A week later, Rosa called again. Lyle Craddock had been found. He was living under an alias in Oregon, terminally ill and confined to a hospice care center. Claire initially said no to the visit, but 2 days later, she changed her mind. The hospital was stark and cold, the air filled with antiseptic. Claire walked down a tiled hallway, heart pounding, until she reached the room. Lyle lay in bed, frail, eyes sunken. Tubes wrapped around his face, machines humming softly. When he looked up and saw her, his eyes widened. "I know you," he croaked. Claire stepped into the room, her voice firm. "You don't know me. You stole me." He coughed, struggling to speak. "I gave you a better life." "No," Claire snapped. "You sold me, like a thing, like I didn't matter." He turned away, voice barely a whisper. "I did what I was paid to do." "You ended lives," Claire said. Her fists clenched. "You broke my mother's. You left children afraid of their shadows." Lyle had no defense. He merely whispered, "I'm sorry." Claire leaned in, her voice low. "Not enough." She turned and walked out, not looking back. Back in Helena, Claire sat with Leanne beneath the same oak tree in her backyard. A new drawing rested in her lap, one she'd made recently. She showed herself in the center, whole and smiling. Around her were the people who helped her remember who she was: Paul, Leanne, Amy, Rosa, and Margaret. A ring of names and love. Amy handed her a small note, something she had found tucked inside an old book from their childhood. It was written in crayon, Claire's handwriting, age 6. "If I forget who I am, please help me remember." Claire clutched it to her chest and whispered, "I remember now." That winter arrived early in Helena. Snow fell in quiet blankets, covering the streets, the rooftops, the trees. It wasn't a storm. It was a hush, a reminder. To stop, to breathe, to remember. Claire Markham, once known as Claire Jensen, walked through the snowfall wrapped in her favorite coat, a scarf looped around her neck. In one hand, a small, wrapped package, in the other, a photo, her as a child, holding a unicorn plush, smiling toward something off camera. She had stared at it for weeks, not because of what it showed, but because of what it meant, that she wasn't the only one, that someone else, somewhere, might still be waiting to be remembered. That morning she met with Rosa in a quiet break room at the police station. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old cleaning fluid. "There are more," Claire said. Rosa nodded. "We think Lyle worked with others. 2, maybe 3. We've uncovered connections to 3 undocumented placements." Claire drew a breath. "What happens next?" "We open the files. We start the process. Families need to know." Claire hesitated, then said, "Let me help." Rosa looked surprised. "You don't owe anyone that." Claire smiled softly. "I remember what it's like to feel lost. I want to help someone else feel found." That night, Claire stood in front of a classroom and began. The invitation came from the local community center, a modest building with creaky floorboards and folding chairs, but its message carried weight. Word had spread, gently but insistently. Claire Markham, the girl who vanished in 1988 and was found alive decades later, was going to speak. Some called it a miracle. Others, a headline waiting to happen. But Claire wasn't there to be anyone's curiosity or symbol. She wasn't a news clip. She wasn't a hashtag. As she stood beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights, a modest podium before her, a paper trembling lightly in her hands, she exhaled deeply. "I don't remember everything," she began, her voice clear though soft. "I may never remember it all, but I remember who I am now." She paused, eyes sweeping the small crowd of neighbors, strangers, teachers, librarians, and friends. "And I remember who loved me," she added, voice cracking. "And who didn't." A beat of silence followed before soft applause rippled through the room. Some clapped quietly, respectfully. A few dabbed tears from their eyes. In the back row, a teacher Claire had never met whispered to herself, "She's a survivor." Back home, the holidays took on a new meaning. Leanne, her mother, stayed through the season. They made cinnamon toast together, extra butter, crusts cut off, the way Claire used to love it as a child. It had been more than 3 decades since they decorated a Christmas tree together. This year, they did it slowly, with laughter and tears in equal measure. Amy came over with hot cocoa and string lights. Margaret sent an ornament shaped like a pen. Rosa dropped off gingerbread cookies wrapped in wax paper. Even the quiet librarian from the Helena archives stopped by with a stack of used novels and a tin of peppermint bark. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And it was enough. One night, Claire sat on the living room floor, her back to the couch, eyes fixed on the flickering tree lights. On the fridge were 2 drawings, one of herself as a child, the other of the woman she'd become. She had drawn them holding hands, one leading the other home. The girl who was taken, the woman who returned. In January, Claire launched a non-profit, the Unicorn Project, named for the mythical creature that had followed her through childhood and memory. The organization offered DNA matching services, legal advocacy, and emotional support to families of missing children and to adults who'd always felt like something in their origin story didn't add up. Letters poured in. Hundreds of them. Most were from mothers, pleading for hope. Some were from adults who had never felt quite right in the life they'd been given. Claire read every single one. She replied to each, even if just with a note of solidarity. One letter stood out, from a woman in Nevada named Sarah. Sarah wrote, "I have no memories before I was 7. I've never had a birth certificate. I've always felt like someone out there is still waiting for me." Claire folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a new folder labeled Possible. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered into the quiet, "I see you." Because once, she had needed someone to say the same. The snow melted. The grass returned. The oak tree in her backyard bloomed again. Claire sat beneath it on a warm afternoon, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She filled the page completely. A swing set, a cat, a bookshelf, a music box, a small girl in the center holding it all together. At the bottom, she signed it, Claire Markham, 2025. She smiled. Her name, finally, made sense. She visited Paul's grave on a cloudy morning. No flowers, just a gift. She knelt and placed a folded copy of her drawing at the base of the stone. "I wish you had told the truth," she whispered. "But thank you for keeping me alive." She stood as the wind rustled through the branches. Somewhere far off, a chime rang. The past had not vanished. It had simply been waiting, quiet and patient, until she was finally ready to listen.